I am Alva Taylor here at the Center for Digital Strategies at Tuck, and we're pleased to have Nicholas Carr, who has written several books, very highly regarded books, and in particular Shallows, who's has garnered many awards and is really considered one of the foremost thinkers in the world about how information and information access is changing our lives. So welcome. Here at the Center for Digital Strategies, we think about how changes in the digital world affects how we do business. First, could you give us a little bit of a sense of your overall view of how the information explosion and our ability to access is changing how we think about things and how people think, and then how that affects business?
One thing that's happened is that computer technology, at least since the origin of the World Wide Web, but even more intensely, more recently with the spread of smartphones and tablets, has kind of infused itself into our day-to-day life in a way that I think is unprecedented in the history of technology. I mean, we've never interacted with a media technology the way we interact with the online world through our smartphones and computers and so forth. And that's true not only when we're on the job, but when we're off the job as well. And, my original writing was more focused on economic and managerial implications of information technology. And I became interested in the last few years with the question of how does this constant interaction with the online world, with streams of information, how does that influence the way we think, in the way we perceive the world? And I think there's a trade-off that's going on. On the one hand, we get all the benefits of having instant access to incredible amounts of information, to extraordinarily powerful communication tools. We can connect with colleagues or friends or family all the time in a way that was difficult. But I think there's something that's lost along the way. And what's lost is having time available to actually concentrate your mind on one thing, on one hard problem, one conversation, one book, kind of anything where you have to be attentive and screen out interruptions and distractions. So we've created this technology, this very powerful technology that unfortunately I think has the side effect of kind of keeping us in this permanent state of distraction and interruption, multitasking. And there's much that's good with that, but I think that what brain science tells us is that there are important ways of thinking that only happen when you screen out flows of information and actually pay attention. And that's when I think you get conceptual thinking, you get kind of the big picture thinking, you make unexpected connections between far-flung ideas and facts. That only happens when you're kind of have a calm mind, focused, attentive, and we're kind of stealing from ourselves opportunities to practice those attentive ways of thinking. And as a result, I fear, whether it's at work or at home or at play or whatever, you lose something important about your potential as a thinker when you're always processing flows of information and are never kind of alone with your thoughts.
Okay. So if that's how things are going, how does that change what we think about and how we manage organizations? If the interaction of managers and workers in organizations are, I don't want to say distracted, but multitasking.
Yeah.
How does that change the way organizations have to act and manage?
I think the first question is, does the organization simply adapt to these changes in the way people are processing information, the way they're connected all the time, and reform itself on the assumption that people are going to be distracted and interrupted and processing messages all the time? Or do organizations push back a little bit against that trend and actually set up some processes, some procedures that encourage people, when they're engaged in certain kind of tasks where you want conceptual thinking and creative thinking, encourage people to kind of turn off the technology for a while. And And to me, I would actually argue it's important for businesses and other organizations to think about that latter course, not to say let's work on the assumption that people are going to be constantly multitasking, constantly distracted. Instead, let's see if we can shape some of our processes to encourage attentive thinking. Because up until now, I think a lot of businesses have gone on the assumption that the more information, the better, under any circumstance. Right. And so we're going to do whatever we can to optimize the flow of information throughout the organization, to connect, our own systems with the net, bring in social media type things. And it's all that the whole focus is on the more and the faster the information that comes into the organization, the better. And I think you can understand why, that's been the assumption, because in the past, the constraint on the flow of information was an impediment to organizations. But I do think that there's a mistake going on, and that is that businesses often lose sight of the fact that there are some people in some jobs doing certain things where actually their performance would be better if they weren't interrupted. If there wasn't the expectation, and this is an expectation that's prominent in many businesses, that you're constantly monitoring messages, constantly monitoring email, texts, all the various ways we communicate today. And businesses send out signals that really you're expected to constantly be in touch, constantly monitoring. And, if you don't respond immediately, people start to think, what's going on with this person. And so to me, I think it makes sense for businesses to stop and say, are there some circumstances where we want to encourage kind of long-term thinking, deep thinking, conceptual thinking, critical thinking? And should we send out signals that it's okay to disconnect for a while if you're in one of these tasks, in one of these jobs? And my hope is that more and more companies will take that kind of more nuanced view, that there are different flows of information that make sense for different jobs and for different people.
That's interesting. I think you do see companies saying things like, you can't bring electronic devices to meetings, for example. But it is such a big pushback, given that often companies have been successful because of their ability to access information, or resources in general, right? The history of kind of U.S. businesses is the more resources you get, the better. And information is a resource. Yeah. So the companies that were able to kind of gather more information did better. And so this idea of limiting that turning that spigot off a little bit, or at least turning it down, is foreign to a lot of companies. Where does things like, when I think about what companies are doing, bring your own device, privacy, security, how does that play into this?
There's these kind of issues about cognition and different ways of thinking. And then there are all sorts of technological issues that arise when, suddenly control is removed from the traditional information technology department, traditional gatekeepers of information and of software and of devices. And it seems to me that, that change has already happened, that people come into the workforce these days expecting to have a great deal of freedom in the information sources they can tap into, the devices they can use. And it's very, very difficult to kind of try to stop that tide. So, but on the other hand, businesses have certain very important legal and other things they have to worry about when it comes to privacy, when it comes to sharing information. And so it's this fine line that companies, particularly companies that are dealing with sensitive customer information in other types of information, it's this fine line that you have to walk between control and freedom of the employee. But I think in general the trend has been very strongly and will continue to be toward giving people more choice, and in some cases that means placing more trust in people and taking on the risk that always goes with that, but it's often worth it.